Welcome here. So as we continue, this is an important topic. It goes into a lot of what we talked about yesterday, and we're going to continue to talk about as we go through this, because data, data has to be part of the strategy of any CX program these days from that perspective. But let's start off with a quick introduction. So Raghav, if you could start your introduction, and then quickly when you think about that, maybe a quick example where an insight led to a meaningful change in your organization.
Absolutely. I hope everyone can hear me well and clear. My name is Raghav Mohan, and I'm the National Customer Experience Supervisor at Kia Canada. A big part of my role is obviously translating customer insights into actionable strategies at the dealership level. And one example that I can think of recently is when we identified some recurring frustrations in service communications and appointment transparency at the dealerships. We got the insight, but the problem was how to operationalize it across the dealer network consistently. And the way we encountered that was we solved it through targeted coaching programs, through automated dealership follow-ups on behalf of the dealerships, as well as enabling dealer-level visibility. This also sort of resulted in not just improvement in customer experience metrics, but also dealer engagement and accountability. And that's one example that I could think of.
All right, we'll probably revisit that a little bit as we go. So Damien, quick introduction and same question.
Yes, welcome everyone. I lead the payments products, channels, and the customer experience pillar at Metrolinx with a focus on making the transit payment rider experience simple, intuitive, and accessible across the region. One example of insights driving real change, we leverage AI to analyze customer verbatim feedback. And so what used to take us 2 to 3 days now happens almost instantly. And so on any given month, we will have over, on average, 4,000 customer verbatims to sift through. And so the real win was using AI to analyze that feedback. We achieve over 90% accuracy at scale, and we're able to take out the human bias out of that analysis. So that's the example.
That's a great example for sure. Randy.
Yeah, Randy Clapp, GM for Amplify Canada, and one of my most recent challenges was actually getting up those stairs. I was telling a colleague. I moved 2 tons of crusher run over the weekend, and when I walked up and saw these stairs, I thought, oh boy, am I going to make it up? But I did. So one of the interesting pieces of insight, and we're talking about the front line and talk about coaching effectiveness, is we always looked at coaching as an activity that presumably was making things better because you're pulling agents off productive state to coach them and put them back on the floor. And we really looked at that and said, is it driving the kind of outcome that we expect to get out of that? So we created this index, Coaching Effectiveness Index, and we found these 2 pretty interesting numbers, 60% and 40%. If a frontline leader had a Coaching Effectiveness Index of above 60%, there was a 90% likelihood that they were going to improve that agent once they've been coached. Between 40% and 60%, there was a lot of randomness. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But here's what we didn't expect to find. If a frontline leader had a coaching effectiveness index of below 40%, every time they pulled an agent off productive state and coached them, they actually made them worse. And depending on the metric that we looked at, there was actually more frontline leaders coaching agents, making them worse and putting them back on the floor. And we really looked at it and said, well, what is driving that? And the first obvious reason was, well, not every frontline leader is good at coaching every single behavior, and that's certainly true. But more often what we found in speaking to how do you turn insights to action is they were actually not diagnosing the problem properly and coaching them on something that they were actually already pretty good at, telling them to change, confusing them, and then making them worse as a result. So really what it spoke to is, a frontline leader doesn't have, they're probably the busiest, most undervalued individual on the contact center floor, in my opinion. And they certainly don't have the time in the day to diagnose the amount of information they need to go through to figure out, well, what does this agent actually need help with? What's the particular topic? And then what's the most effective way of teaching them something around that topic? So it was really around viewing coaching not really as an activity, but as an outcome that you're trying to drive.
Yeah, you never want things to get worse after you've done the effort of training or coaching, right?
Yeah.
So that's an important one. So as we think about it, yesterday we talked a lot about being data rich but insight poor. How do we turn data into insights? But today we're kind of taking that to the next level. Now there's insight rich but action poor. Taking it to that final step of doing something with the insights that you've gathered. So everybody talks about being data driven and it being part of the DNA, but what has to be in place for an insight to actually get the attention of executive leaders? So Damien, let's start with you.
Yeah, the biggest gap I see is turning segmentation into action. And at Metrolinx, we know our customer base. We have the cash paying customers, we have open payment mobile wallet customers, but insights became into action when we saw real demand. Customers that are riding transit, they wanted, the same way they pay for groceries, they wanted to use their debit and credit to ride transit. So we listened, and so we launched open payment and we launched mobile wallet. But the biggest question we have to ask ourselves is, who's getting left behind? And so we have the cash-paying customers who, as we build out our digital capabilities, and it's great to have those options, but for cash-paying customers, they need convenience to load their Presto cards. And so through strategic partnership with Loblaws and through their Loblaw banner, through Shoppers Drug Mart and recently some no-frills, we're able to expand our distribution footprint to ensure convenience for cash-paying customers. So the real question, or the test is not about do we know our segments, is are we making the right decision to satisfy all the segments?
Yeah, that's great. Great examples. Randy, what would you add to that?
Yeah, what I see really good CX companies do, not CX companies, but contact centers, is rather than kind of creating a QA evaluation form, what they do is they model them. So if you think about a people-centric organization, right, you see this bell curve of performance. So there's a few low performers, a few high performers, and then this sort of mite in the middle. And what they do is, rather than a QA scorecard, they model the behaviors of that high-performing persona, and then they create a digital representation of that. And that, in effect, kind of replaces their QA scorecard. And then they start comparing the rest of the organization with that high-performing persona. And based on that comparison, you're going to find 10 or 15 things that a good agent is doing that an average performant agent isn't doing. Well, you can't coach them on 10 or 15 things at once. You got to pick one. And what these companies have figured out to do is they create what they call a next best action. So what's the next most impactful topic that I need to train up this agent on to make them perform better? And then, like you said before, measuring the effectiveness of that activity that you took. And it doesn't have to be a coaching action. It could be pushing a knowledge article to them. And did they consume it? Did they understand it? So I think it's really a process of, what are my best people doing? What's the rest of the organization doing, and making that comparison, finding the delta, and then picking the right action to take, and then just progressing through that.
Raghav, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think we used to have this term called content lost in translation, but I guess in this context, data is, or rather, like you said, the gap happens because content is lost when you move across verticals or functions. And that's where I think it's critical, it's key, where when you, especially in customer insights, I feel like the data sits mostly in customer experience dedicated teams. But when you move across functions, they don't have much idea about that. So I think that's what's critical: cross-functional collaboration and sort of a shared accountability across functions is critical to reduce this gap. Yeah.
So we collect a lot of feedback, in many ways now, and it's but changing actual decisions, making the business act differently, obviously, is a little more of that challenge. So when an insight, what do you have to look at to make sure leaders, the executives, buy into this change? Because ultimately, it's not going to change if they don't. So how do you look at that? So Damien, we'll start with you again.
Yeah, executives don't act on data alone. They act on quantified outcomes. And for me, an example is early days CSAT was 72%. And we did a jurisdictional scan. We looked at global peers, and best in class said CSAT was 85%. So that drove urgency. And so what worked was a simple story, having a defined target and a quantified roadmap to help us get there. So essentially, we put an impact to each initiative. So from everything we launched, from mobile wallet to open payment to digital improvements, the results were astounding. We went from 72% to 88% CSAT score last year. That was fantastic. On a bigger scale, we use customer insight to look at transit rider affordability. And that data actually helped us to launch the One Fare program. So the One Fare program, because of that, transit riders are able to, on average, keep in their pockets $1,200 annually. So this is a good example of when insights goes beyond CX. It actually helps shapes policy.
Raghav, what would you add? How do you get executives to buy in?
Yeah, I think if insights are in CX language, I don't think there's enough buy-in there. But once you frame it in business language, meaning when you tie these issues to business or real business outcomes like profitability, retention, loyalty, then you would see that attention automatically happening there. And B, there needs to be credibility and scalability of the insights that you're presenting. Meaning, if it's just one random comment from a customer, then that's probably not going to sell. But if you somehow take the effort to collect the same sort of trends from multiple sources, like survey feedback from Google reviews, online reputation, observations, in-person observations, then that would add credibility to that. And finally, I think rather than just say what the problem is, if you sort of recommend a path forward to resolving it, that would again stir up some attention. So the executives are looking not just for problems, they're looking for solutions as well. Yeah.
Randy, what would you add?
Yeah, I think it depends on which executive you're talking to. Like if you're talking to a CFO, what they're going to want to know is how much are you going to spend, what am I going to get back, and when am I going to get it back? If you're talking to a product person, I remember a product person telling me one time, I always remember this, they said, an average person has between 20 and 50 unique different conversations every single day. I want the conversation that my agents are going to have with my consumers to be the best one that person had all day, including with their wives, their spouses, their kids. I want that conversation to be the best one that they had all day. So you can see two different dynamics going. It doesn't care about ROI. The CFO doesn't care about that conversation. So really, you got to isolate who you're talking to and kind of what their focus is, and then connect with them at that level. And now it's kind of interesting when you get them all in the same room at the same time. It's kind of hard to control that conversation, but really need to know your audience and then connect with them at that level.
Yeah, I think the data is so important. I think the flip side of that, some of that data is actually raw, examples. And we recently doing a journey mapping exercise, we're interviewing clients, and we come up with this video snippet of one of their customers, and that has now gone viral around the organization, too. So it is balancing that, because you kind of mentioned you have to model the data and the story at the same time, because there is got to be a little bit of that emotional connection. So, through that process and through all of these insights that you gather and the options, you can't do everything, right? Andy, you just kind of said ROI. You gotta look at that. So when you're thinking about the ROI that needs to be determined, especially for CX related efforts, Raghav, we'll start with you. How do you determine that ROI?
I guess, again, depends on the industry, of course. In my line of expertise, I would say three things. First is any customer impact, meaning any potential litigations, or any brand image issues, or any satisfaction issue, or any loyalty issues from the customer. And B would be business impact. Like I mentioned, any changes to business profitability, dealer level performance, revenue, top line, bottom line. That would be like the second area of I would say another different sort of set of factors I would use for ROI. And C, I would say what feasibility or scalability, right? So in my experience, I've seen anything that's loud, like an issue that's loud, may not necessarily be the one that you need to chase after. Sometimes even the most simplest ones, the low-hanging fruit, that if you try to resolve that, it would sort of affect a broader range of customers. I think that's another measure of ROI that we personally use, how feasible and how scalable it is in the short term as well as the long term. That would be my.
Yeah, you got to be able to measure the impact, and you've got to tie it to that end result. Because if your ROI is a 1-point increase in NPS, that doesn't give you anything, right? You got to tie that. So, Damien, what would you add?
I think Raghav said it. I remember my CEO saying, high CSAT drives revenue. And for us, it's every CSAT initiative that we deliver on, we make sure it's quantifiable. And so, again, I gave you the example of scaling up from 72% to 88%. That's essentially quantifying the impact of everything that we do.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about that yesterday. You got to look at it in the context of the journey, because you can't just say we're going to improve handle time across all calls by X. You have to be specific. You got to really narrow that down. So as we continue, thinking about then, as we're learning more about data and AI use cases, the human context can sometimes think like it's at risk. But we talked yesterday a lot about balancing the human and the technology. So Randy, let's start with you. How do you really make sure that customer is part of the customer experience? That human nature is a key component of this.
Yeah. Anybody from Home Depot in the room? Anybody? I think Home Depot has this just perfectly simple model. Our founder said, if you look after your people look after your customers, and your customers will look after everything else. And I always remember that. I think, oh, that's, not only do I think it's true, it's really simple to understand, but I think, everybody being human is motivated through self-interest. I don't mean selfishness. I mean, you do things that make you feel good and are helpful. And I think whatever you're trying to change or do in an organization, you have to embed it into the existing workflows, but the way you embed it has to improve their lives. I mean, if it makes their work easier and simpler, they'll adopt it when it's in that workflow. If it doesn't, they won't adopt it. I mean, it's really a question of how many more soccer games do I want to miss because I'm, grinding it out at work. So, what we look at is we look at work, we think about work as work about work, the work you need to do to get meaningful work done versus kind of the meaningful work. And the way, if you can drive out that work about work, and and leave the meaningful work on the floor, and get rid of the grind and the daily kind of thing that you do at work, I think that people will adopt that much, much quicker if they see that it's embedded in the workflow and it's helpful. So that's kind of my take, and we've all implemented different systems and tools, and some of them have worked and some of them haven't worked. But whenever I've seen a successful implementation of change, that's been the reason why it's been adopted, because it is actually helpful and more meaningful in the work that they do.
That's great. Damien, what would you add?
I would say there's, recently we launched a new contact center, and with advanced AI, some pretty powerful tools. But earlier on, the data told us something wasn't working. And the fix wasn't more tech, it was actually people. What ended up happening was we had Presto subject matter experts at the contact center facility, boots on ground, sitting side by side with the agents. And the turnaround was almost immediate. It was quite significant. The key learning we learned there is technology scales experience, but people restores it when it breaks.
A lot of workarounds go on. That's one of the things we see a lot when AI is implemented or tech is implemented is you lose sight of what people have been doing to fix the issues, but never documenting it over time. So, but Raghav, what would you add to that?
Yeah, this is one of my most favorite questions because I feel like sometimes people chase after these scores a lot of times, but I mean, I'm pretty sure it's a common terminology, the lead versus the lag KPIs. People always chase, even dealerships today chase, okay, I'm excited that you got this new car, can you give us a perfect 10? I mean, you're really chasing after a score rather than chasing after some key critical processes that you can actually engage the customer with along the way during the purchase process rather. I think that's where human empathy, human touch comes into play. And the way I look at it is I do is combine quantitative metrics with qualitative context, and that's where I look at the verbatim, and believe it or not, customer verbatim actually tells a lot about what actually happened beyond just the numbers. 2 surveys, exact same scores on the quantitative side, but they may be scored that way for very different reasons. I think that's important, and like I said, I think people should chase after the lag KPIs, the sort of processes that lead to a better score, rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I think there's a future here. I like to talk about it, kind of the multiverse of what can happen, especially when you think about contact centers and customer service as the part of the extension of the experiences. The front lines can be replaced completely, which is what a lot of people are talking about, or that front line actually could be no longer your entry point to a company that can, the lowest level. We could actually invest even more. I mean, this could be a high-paid frontline job because they're not doing everything. They're really focused on that human connection. And I think there are going to be some companies that differentiate themselves because of that. So, part of that then is, when you think of working across an organization, mentioned yesterday, CX is everybody's responsibility, but sometimes when it's everyone's, it's no one's. So how do you make sure that the entire organization is really aligned to this, that you break the silos, you make sure that cross-functional teams are in there? Let me just kind of open up. Who wants to answer that first?
Me?
Who wants to?
Yeah, I can do that. It's okay. So one of the things that that's again something that I can pull from my recent example. We tried nationally across the network. We tried to implement an initiative to incentivize frontline people to offer better customer experiences to all our customers. But what was happening, we tried to incentivize frontline, but there was no engagement from our field, from our field team, from our after-sales team, from our parts team. So again, like you said, there's a lot of disconnect, it's sort of siloed out. So again, this was again something that I had to engage all the way up to the CEO and say, hey, is there any way we can sort of have a shared accountability? Perhaps add a CX target to our performance goals. And that worked like magic. As soon as we did that, as soon as we added CX to every function's performance goals, that immediately had a positive impact on our CX metrics. Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, I can follow on that. In my experience, CX doesn't sustain on programs. It sustains on culture. So at Metrolinx, CSAT is not just a metric. It's shared accountability across all the various pillars. And what I've found is when the organization as a whole puts the customer front and center, then momentum follows. And this is especially important in the transit space because we service everybody from essential workers, seniors, families. So every single interaction matters, every trip matters. And so we try to simplify that, right? It's quite simple with the mindset. It's relentless focus on the customer, like every day, every single journey.
I'll just tell a story. I don't know if this will be helpful or not. When I started my career as a software engineer, and then I was a supervisor of software engineers and a manager of software engineers, I had a peer who ran a quality team, so they did all the testing of the code that we developed. And we were always at each other, like, why does it take so long to develop? Why does it take so long to test? And there was always this battle, and finally we kind of went to a head. It got a little ugly. We went into our manager, and we said, we have these differences, we can't resolve them, you got to do something. And he said, if you leave it up to me, you're not going to like the answer. And we said, well, you're going to do it. And he said, okay, when you leave this room, Randy, you're going to run the quality group, and Bob, you're going to run the apps group. And it took us about a week and a half of running each other's groups to find out, it's not as easy as what it looks over there. And we shook hands and agreed that we wanted to go back to our old jobs, and we had a lot more respect for each other as a result. So, I mean, it was a very inventive way of saying, okay, I'm going to take the friction out, and you guys are going to figure this out on your own.
Yeah, because I think it is hard to argue when you're so ingrained in your potential silo that. But taking that, in my first book, I kind of talked about it as the customer journey is like a river. We all own parts of the river. But there are a lot of rapids, there are a lot of rocks that get in the way, and so we have to understand that. But by looking back and thinking about how it impacts them, that's kind of a key area. So we have time for some questions. Who's got a question for this panel? Do we have a mic runner?
Hi, good morning. This question is for Raghav. In the automotive industry, most of the CX experience happens outside the OEM control. So how are you using your data strategy to capture those experiences and hold those partners, such as part suppliers, repair shops, et cetera, aftermarket, to how are you holding them accountable to your standards?
Yeah, great question. You're right. I mean, a lot of our, unfortunately, as much as we would like to, it's not all in our control. We have a lot of moving parts outside of the OEM world. Well, I would look at it this way. Really, I would say 80% of customer experience is determined by how they are treated at the dealership level. Yes, there are some components that's not really controlled by the dealership, by frankly even us, especially what happened during COVID when we were short of supply. But again, I would say there have been scenarios, a very good, for example, a very nice, let's say a very talented service advisor or a sales advisor who's sort of faced with a similar challenge of short supply of cars. How he communicates to the customer, that matters, and it's day and night between a good dealer and a not so good dealer, right? So again, communication is key here, presentation is key here, and transparency, how transparent you are And it's not just Kia, for example, it's everyone faced at that time. So it's, again, how you communicate that to the customer that's what I think makes a difference there. Yeah.
Yeah, CX is very different in B2B with so many moving parts that you don't control, absolutely. Other question?
Hi. I was wondering, you were talking about implementing goals for all levels and departments of the organization to have a CX goal. Could you give some specific examples of different types of goals you might have across those departments?
Yeah, for sure. I would say in the last couple of years, we introduced a component to every employee in our organization. And it's not necessarily, I wouldn't call that an operational goal. We have obviously a functional operational goal versus a company culture goal. I think this would be more like come under company culture, even though it's not part of a behavioral attitude. It's like how you contribute towards a customer's experience. So it was like, and we wouldn't give this to a random, like obviously this wouldn't be part of someone in finance or IT, for example, because they have no control over that. But this would be more like to people in, let's say, marketing or after sales, where they're very much in control of customer experience in a way, in some capacity or the other. So I think the one goal we added to folks in this area was like NPS and retention, loyalty, like the percentage. We added that to the goal, and like I said, there was an immediate uptick in these metrics that we found. So it's just, again, this involved a lot of engagement from all the way higher up, all the way up to the CEO to make sure everyone has this goal tied to their performance. Yeah.
How have you done different, or how have you done different goals?
Yeah, I would say if you work in an organization where you have a contact center, for example, one of the things we did from a leadership perspective, we assigned goals to each individual across the organization to listen, to spend at least an hour or two each month listening to customer calls. When you listen to the customer calls, you get firsthand information on what the customer issues are, some of the challenges. You even get opportunities on how to improve your product and your overall experience. So that's how we tie the goal to.
Yeah, I know we're running out. I would just add one other thing. Everybody has a customer. Even if you're a support group, you're supporting a customer, right? And I would just say that I really like that Home Depot model. Think about who your customer is, and then think about if you treat your employees good, they'll treat your customers good, and your customers will look after everything else. So just think about who's your customer, even if you're in a support role. Workforce has one, quality has one, you all have one.
Absolutely. Well, as mentioned, we are at time and a little over, but which is a good thing. So we're going to actually break for just a second. Don't leave the room because we got about a couple of minutes for the other two tracks to join us because everybody's going to be together for this next session. But help me thank this great panel for some really good content. All right, thank you.